rolling. Okay, anytime.
All right, a couple of things before we start. One, if you could introduce yourself by name and spell your name.
I am Sophie Williams, SophieWilliams.
And the name of your business?
Raven Breads, Ravenbreads.
Okay. So the other thing is that I neglected to bring a release form for you to sign authorizing me to use your likeness in a documentary film that we're making called Grain Changers. And so do we have your permission?
You have my permission.
And to use your likeness for promotional purposes as well?
Yes.
Okay.
One quick thing is, what would you consider to be a good title for you? Baker or something along those lines?
Sure.
Baker.
Baker company name.
Owner.
of Raven Breads.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Sure.
Perfect.
Yeah. Owner Baker. Actually.
Sole employee. Cyclist.
Am I going to get to taste your bread?
Yeah, I've got 2 loaves in there for you,
wonderful.
a mountain rye and this week's Baker's
Wonderful,
Choice.
Wonderful. Oh, great. So if you could, some biographical questions about why did you become a baker? How did it happen?
I came at baking sideways. I guess I had been farming in this region for 3 years, and I'd been going to the grain gathering, which was at that point the Kneading Conference down in Skagit that Steve Jones was hosting at the WSU Extension. And so I'd met a lot of bakers, and I knew that they were really great. And so when I decided I was not going to be a farmer, I was trying to think of another way to be part of the local food system and working with my hands and also intellectually engaged in my work. And I had this very romantic notion of baking because I'd met all of these amazing bakers in this context that's like summer camp, basically, where everyone's just like so excited to be together. And so I thought, I could be a baker. It can't be any harder than farming. And so I decided to become a baker. There was also, on top of that, there's also the fact that there's no good bread here in Bellingham, in a town of almost 100,000 people. I mean, we have Bread Farm down in the valley, and they're wonderful, but they're 20 miles away. And so it felt like that was a hole, and at that point, people weren't really talking in the same way they are now about local grains, and so it felt like an important part of the food system to get people thinking about and talking about what it means to eat local grains and local bread.
Who are your customers? Oh, can I interrupt for, you can keep rolling, but, so my questions are not going to come up on camera. So if there's a way for you to,
rephrase.
Without a great deal of artificiality, begin your response by rephrasing the question. So who are your customers?
I sell both retail and wholesale, and my retail customers are mainly through the farmers market. And I've been a farmers market member for 5 years, and so I have a really strong customer base, and they feel very invested in the bakery, which is great. And then wholesale, I sell to local restaurants and cafes.
Okay, so I asked you before we started, and I'd like to just without a great deal of, you don't have to elaborate for too long because I want to move on to some other questions, but what...
Hi.
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
What I'd like to hear from you is what your views are on the types of wheat that you use and the types of grains that you use.
I think that for bakers and chefs, it's really important to create food that's conscious of place. And so here that means rye and wheat, and in other places maybe that means maize or other grains. And I don't know, I don't feel like there's like a super, there's no single right way to do local food. But I do think that building a food system inside the ecology of a place rather than on top of it is really important.
Why do you think that's the case?
Um,
Local food, what makes local food local, and why is it important to the place and the people?
I think that building local food systems is culturally important because it connects us more deeply to place and to our wider community, and I think that ecologically building local food systems makes our food system more resilient and more adaptive, and helps us step away from the commodity food system, which is very important.
Okay, so you, I'd like you to say this on camera, that you bake with whole grains, and why you do that.
So Raven Breads is an entirely whole grain bakery. I don't use any extracted grains. And when I first started out the first year that I had this business, I was using white flour because I was using tartine, or the tartine books, as my like stepping stone into the baking world. And they're very white flour based. But the winter after I started, I went and spent 3 weeks with Dawn Woodward, who's this fantastic baker in Toronto who uses entirely whole Ontario-grown grains, and she is a really strong advocate for local grains, and that got me thinking about the importance of using grain for flavor and nutrition, and not just as like a structural component in one's baking, but like using it for the grain itself. And then I guess compounding that, our local mill, at the time, we now have 2 local mills, but 5 years ago we only had the one, and they were only making whole grain flour. And so to use white flour is having to import flour from central milling, which didn't feel like it fit my general business philosophy. And so it made sense to shift to using entirely locally milled whole grain flour.
So the supplier of whole grain flour that you rely on, can you say a little bit about the miller?
Yeah, so I buy all my flour from Fairhaven Organic Flour Mill, which used to be here in Bellingham and now is down in Skagit, so just south of here. And they have a couple of hammer mills and hammer mill whole grains, and they direct contract with a lot of farmers, and some grains they buy through Montana Milling in their contracts. But our rye is all grown right here. It's like grown about 10 miles away, and it's beautiful. And the pastry wheat is also from really close by, from the same farm. And the hard red wheat, which is Buck Pronto right now, and a few of the other grains are coming from Walla Walla in eastern Washington. So the bulk, like 95% of the grains that I use are from here and milled just down in the valley, which is wonderful.
So why white flour? What's wrong with white flour?
There's nothing wrong with.
Can I get you to start? I don't use white flour.
Oh.
Something like that.
Yeah, I don't use white flour because I want to make good food, and I think that, I mean, there's definitely I will eat a whole baguette myself with butter and enjoy it. I think that there's nothing inherently wrong with white flour for a treat, like as a special thing, but in my daily bread and in the daily bread that I make for people, I want it to be nutritious and flavorful and the best that it can be, and I don't think that you can get that with extracted grains.
Can you comment on what you've learned about the nutritional value of whole grains?
I don't know that I
Even
can.
not as a scientist necessarily. I'm not looking for you to express it as a scientist, but you must have picked up, in addition to flavor, which feel free to say more if you want. In addition to flavor, you have gotten some sense of the nutritional benefits, the superior nutritional benefits of whole grains to white flour. And if just say it in what inspired you. Clearly, there was something that pushed you in that direction. So I'm trying to get you to talk about it.
I bake with whole grains because I think that they're more interesting and flavorful, and they're a challenge, and I like a challenge. They're just technically much more difficult to work with, and because when you're eating grains as the basis of your diet, which I do and a lot of people do, I think, and every nutritionist I've ever talked to thinks that eating whole grains as the basis of a diet rather than white or extracted grains is healthier. And so it makes a lot of sense to me for our daily bread to be whole grain and to save, make brioche, make ciabatta, and have it be something special. But I think for our daily bread, it makes sense that we are eating food, and for me, food means whole grains.
Was there a time when wheat was just wheat for you, and if so, when did things change?
I don't think that I really thought about varieties of grain or like really much beyond good farming practices and bad farming practices until I started baking. And so I wasn't thinking about different wheat varieties or about the different properties of different grains for baking or like eating purposes as much as I was thinking about cover crops and crop rotation and building soil and soil health. So I definitely came more. I think that there were a lot of challenges and a lot of unnecessary challenges to starting baking without any commercial kitchen experience. I had to reinvent the wheel a lot of times unnecessarily, and I made a lot of mistakes that I probably could have avoided had I worked in commercial bakeries or commercial kitchens. But I do think that coming in without kind of that knowledge of the way that things are supposed to be, and that like assumption of what customers want, that customers want white bread and they want big airy bread and they want nice sandwich loaves in plastic bags and they want croissant. Not having that in my head and not having that in my hands, like learning by trial and error and experimentation, meant that I was able to see my way into baking with whole grains and have that be a thing that I could persist in even when it was difficult. I don't know if that makes sense.
So you've mentioned that you haven't had a long apprenticeship with any bakery, or you haven't studied. You don't have a lot of prior to your bakery professional experience in cooking or in the food industry. So you mentioned yesterday that, and I think I've observed, I remember a few months ago, you were posting on Instagram that you were traveling around visiting bakeries and getting exposure to, I guess, volunteering, or what do you call it when?
Staging.
Huh?
Staging.
Staging. You were doing that at different bakeries in the Northeast. Is that right?
That is, yeah. So
So could you talk about that and why you did it and where you went, what you got out of it?
Yeah. in part because I don't have any commercial kitchen experience, and it's really useful to see how other people do things, and in part because I work by myself and I work a lot, and it's pretty isolating, even in the age of social media. I find it really valuable every winter to go and visit other bakers and maintain those connections and bring some of the connections that I only had online into real life. So one winter I road tripped down the coast and visited bakeries in Seattle and Portland and Northern California and down into the Bay Area. And one winter I shipped my bike out to South Carolina and walked from the airport to pick it up and reassembled it from the box, and then rode up into Asheville and through North Carolina visiting bakeries. And this past winter, I flew out to New York and rented a car and drove up through upstate New York and into Vermont to visit a bunch of the really fantastic Miller bakers who are out that way.
Could you name a couple of bakeries in the North Carolina and New England trip?
Yeah, so when I bike toured through North Carolina, I flew into Greensboro and rode up to Asheville and went over to Farm and Sparrow, which no longer exists, Dave Bauer's bakery, and Dave Bauer now has another project, a mill project, I believe, going on. And then I went up to visit Tara Jensen at Smoke Signals, which she's no longer there. She's over in West Virginia, maybe, or something. And then I went over the mountains and down to Chicken Bridge Bakery and Red Hawk Grains, which is a grain farm that supplies bolted bread and Sub Rosa, and a number of the other bakeries that mill in-house. And then I went out to Raleigh to visit Bolted. So that was that bike trip. And this winter, when I was driving on the East Coast, I visited Elmore Mountain, as everyone does, because Blair and Andrew are incredibly welcoming and fantastic artisans. And I went over and visited Randy at Red Hen, and down to Sparrow Bush in upstate New York. And then I swung down to Lost Bread in Philadelphia.
I never went there in Philadelphia.
They're doing crazy things, really crazy things.
I lived in Philly for half a year in 2014 and got my bread from Metropolitan Bakery because that was the most convenient.
I think Alex Baugh I don't think he's had Lost Bread for that long.
Okay.
But they're pretty wacky. They're amazing. They put out a monthly grain zine. So they have like a grain CSA, and every month the subscribers get they get like whole grain and milled grain and polenta or like other grain products, and then they also get a bunch of products made out of those grains. And then they get this zine with like all sorts of different information collected from the different bakers and like the artisans who are involved in the project about that particular grain. And they're all very punny. They're great.
Can you talk about resistance to what you're trying to do? I mean, what you're trying to do is elevate the kind of bread that you're baking. You'd like more people to buy it, and clearly there is a clientele for it. What do you think is the reason why what you're doing challenges people's assumptions about what good bread is?
I think that people are really excited about good bread, and they're excited about whole grains and sourdough and flavor, whether or not they like know the buzzwords around it. I think market logic says that you need to sell white bread to have a successful business, and on my retail side, I sell mostly rye bread, and that's the element of the business that has a really loyal following. I feel like the most resistance to whole grain sourdough in the way that I'm baking and running the business is actually on the professional side. Like chefs just aren't as progressive as eaters, at least in my experience. They have like pretty set ideas about what bread should be in the role that it should play on their menus or on their tables, and it's really hard to change their minds. They want white and they want mild. They don't want a lot of flavor. Like I've actually had chefs tell me that my bread has too much flavor and they don't know what to do with it. And they have these ideas that come out of culinary school or out of French kitchens, or I don't know, out of like the entire food system that they've been working in, and they're very, very resistant to change. And so it's been much harder to get chefs on board with using whole grain breads than it has to get customers on board with eating dense, hearty, flavorful breads.
Fascinating.
It is.
So, hard to speculate, and we could talk about it later, but I suspect it might have something to do with feeling upstaged by the flavor of the bread. Why do you use sourdough? Why wild fermentation?
I bake all sourdough bread for a lot of the same reasons that I bake whole grain bread. I think that it has more flavor and more complexity and more technical challenge and more nutrition. I think that for my daily bread, I want to be eating fermented grains, whether that's overnight oats or whole grain sourdough bread, and that to me is good food. That's what I want other people to be eating on a daily basis.
Okay, one last question or set of questions has to do with education and literacy. I'm sure you've run across the term grain literacy.
Uh-huh.
Wow, that's loud, isn't it?
The compressor.
Huh? Yeah. Is that okay, Paul?
Oh, it does change things a little bit. It's probably just temporary, right?
Yeah, I don't know how long it'll run.
Should we wait, or do you think we should?
We could wait.
Could we wait? Would
We
you mind
could.
Waiting a bit?
If it seems
Yeah.
like, within 5 minutes, we'll...
Yeah,
Do you
that's
have any
fine.
sense of, like, and do you know what size you take in
Are
men's?
they're men's? Small.
Small. Okay, I'll get you a small.
Cool.
We have a bunch of colors, but I might just have to choose one for you.
You can choose.
Okay. All right. So it's the last few questions
Yeah.
that I have. It has to do with education and literacy, like grain literacy. And you've talked about this a little bit already. But are we recording? Okay. Do you feel a stake in educating people about whole grains?
Do I feel a stake in educating people?
And if so, how is that manifested, for example, in your relationships with chefs and with people who come by the farmer's market?
I don't feel like I owe people education, but I'm excited about what I'm doing, and I'm excited about local grains and local milling and what it means to build a more resilient local grain economy. And so I feel like a lot of that storytelling just like comes across through interactions with customers and through my newsletter. I don't feel like I need to be all things in in this movement. I think that it would be enough to be a baker, but because I like storytelling and I like writing, that is an element as well. Sharing some information about kind of the broader systems outside of like what I'm doing here in this kitchen.
So you mentioned you have a newsletter. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Do you have any copies here?
So I send out an email newsletter every Saturday morning before market. I bake. I bake on Fridays I'm usually in the kitchen from 5 a.m. until 8 or 9 p.m. So I'm pretty blasted by the end of the day on Friday, and then I try my best to wake up early enough on Saturday that I can write my newsletter before I go and pack up for market and make my Saturday morning wholesale deliveries. And it doesn't always happen. Sometimes I just send out the menu for the week. But a lot of the time I write personal essays, basically, about the business and about biking and about the work. And they're often more intimate than I think they would be were I not so tired. Because it's harder to be filtered when you're tired. There's a lot more honesty.
Can we stop for a moment? I just want to ask if could you pull up one of your favorite essays and read it? Would you be willing?
Yes.
Maybe say this is from my newsletter and say what the date was and the title. Hold on.
Anytime.
Okay. This is a newsletter from last May, and I titled it Bakery Dreaming. On long days in the commissary kitchen, I daydream about my bakery. The fluorescent lights above me hum and flicker, casting my workbench sickly yellow against the tan and stainless steel of the windowless room. I daydream about light. The walls of my bakery, I decide, are warm white, catching light from the high windows even on rainy days. I can watch the sky lighten in the morning through those windows. I can watch the days pass and the seasons change. There are no fluorescent lights. The kitchen I share smells of cooking meat, fish sauce, and bleach. I daydream about the smells of my bakery, baking bread, butter and chocolate, coffee, a little wood smoke as I dump the smoked dry berries on the bench into the batch of Volkenbrot in the mixer. The front windows are open, letting in the sun-hot scent of lavender and rosemary from the brick planters of herbs just outside. One of the neighborhood kids pinches off a sprig of mint coming in the front door and carries the bright scent with him as he meanders to the counter, crushing it furtively in his hand. Here in the commissary kitchen, it's always loud. The lights hum, water runs, the dishwasher whooshes, the fan in the convection oven womp womp womps, slightly off-center. Pans clatter, the hood roars, in the prep room, the restaurant cooks are blasting Journey so loud I can feel it through my whole body. I daydream about the sounds of my bakery. I get in early to begin the day's bake alone. I have a few hours before anyone else arrives. Later, perhaps, we'll put on music. The bakery will fill with voices as the benches of the long, battered wood tables in the front fill with customers, sitting down together over coffee and pastries, as the regulars stand chatting in line, catching up on neighborhood gossip, as we stand together over the mixer, talking about yesterday's dough and troubleshooting the new batch of flour. But in the early morning, I work in silence. The sun is just lightening the sky when I pull the first bread out of the oven. It's so quiet in the bakery, I can hear the crust sing.
Can you hold that phone one more time? Just in the same position? I'm just going to get a quick close-up shot of that. And then can you do me a quick favor? Do you still have it open?
Yeah.
Can you read just that last line?
Yeah. after the garbage truck.
We're getting all kinds of sound effects here.
Maybe,
it's the
maybe what we'll
trash.
do, we'll back up to just the last couple of lines.
It's
Yeah.
the trash, so they're passing. Yeah, and one more thing I'll want to do before we wrap up is have you describe the kitchen. Because we have images of it, but it would be good if you could describe the fact that you share it with restaurant cooks from attached restaurants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that quiet enough
Yeah, go
out
ahead
there?
and try it.
The bakery will fill with voices as the benches of the long battered wood tables in front fill with customers sitting down together over coffee and pastries, as the regulars stand chatting in line, catching up on neighborhood gossip, as we stand together over the mixer, talking about yesterday's dough and troubleshooting the new batch of flour. But in the early morning, I work in silence. The sun is just lightening the sky when I pull the first bread out of the oven. It's so quiet in the bakery, I can hear the crust sing.
I don't think we're going to hear those.
You're going to hear what? That back there?
Just as you said, it's so quiet in the bakery.
It was a brilliant. I was thinking, what a brilliant contrast because she's imagining quiet and
Right,
then
right.
we're getting noise.
I know. Exactly.
I think it's actually. Should we try it again?
Oh, yeah.
After the
okay.
truck goes.
You want to try it again?
Yeah, we could try just that
Okay.
last part, I think.
Man, they're taking an awful long
And the reason
time.
why I got a shot of your phone is that's my edit if I have
Need to
use a different take.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, now we can go for it.
Okay. Where are we? This is so small. The bakery will fill with voices as the benches of the long battered wood tables in front fill with customers sitting down together over coffee and pastries, as the regulars stand chatting in line, catching up on neighborhood gossip, as we stand together over the mixer, talking about yesterday's dough and troubleshooting the new batch of flour. But in the early morning, I work in silence. The sun is just lightening the sky when I pull the first bread out of the oven. It's so quiet in the bakery, I can hear the crust sing.
Excellent.
Good. Thank you.
So we're not quite done because
No,
I
I
want
know.
to ask her about the setup.
Yeah.
The way the bakery is shared.
Yeah.
So in your own words, can you just talk about, like, if I were a stranger off the street coming and saying, tell me about your kitchen.
I work in a shared commissary kitchen in downtown Bellingham, which means that I am one of many businesses. There are 2 restaurants that have retail fronts on this building that use the kitchen, and then there's a couple of cafes that don't have baking space for their pastries or their like in-house baking. And in the past, there have been a bunch of food trucks. We don't currently have food trucks, and other businesses. We had a fermented hot sauce guy who had like 50 or 100-gallon barrels of hot sauce fermenting all the time, and people who are making salsa. So it shifts over time. I'm the longest standing tenant. I was the first one in here 5 years ago, and everyone else has kind of come and go. The restaurants have turned over multiple times, but it's been a really good incubator for me. It's allowed me to learn how to bake without going to culinary school or working in someone else's bakery, and also learn how to run a business at the same time without a lot of overhead. And it's very imperfect. It's a restaurant kitchen. There's no baking equipment, so I mix everything by hand, including hundreds of kilos of rye dough every week. And I bake in convection ovens. But it works. It works for now.
And if you could just tell a bit of a story about your hope for a storefront?
I want to turn Raven Breads, which I think will become Raven Bakery to make it a little more all-purpose, into a brick and mortar bakery. I want a neighborhood bakery that's a place for people to gather and a place where I can build a year-round business, because right now I'm really closely tied to the farming season. So because I sell primarily through the markets and through CSAs, my season ramps up through the spring and then is crazy through summer and fall, the most beautiful months here. And then just as the rains return, it starts to slow down. And then in the winter, when it's like overwhelmingly gray and kind of miserable, I only have my wholesale, basically. So I would like to build a business that like spreads out the work over the course of the year and allows me to employ people and be a good employer. And I think that requires some scale that I can't build in a shared kitchen. So that's my hope.
That's wonderful. All right, I don't have any further questions to
I'll throw
ask.
one other. And this one again, you'll just be talking to Andrew. So, but the question concerns that my impression of you as a person who's driven and very motivated to learn as much as you can about baking. You also happen to be a cyclist, and it's quite a combo. What is the kind of thing that really kind of keeps you going? What keeps you coming back to baking? What keeps you coming back to biking your products around?
I don't think that I would be a baker if I had to work in someone else's bakery. I think that I would get bored making the same product and like doing the same actions day after day. I like the routine of craft, but I also really like the constant, I mean, I don't always like it, but in general, I like the constant troubleshooting and the need to always keep learning and pushing myself into new skills that comes with being a business owner. And I think that curiosity and desire to learn is part of what has kept me baking. And also I'm really stubborn. And I think that kind of like willfulness, that stubbornness is also what has kept me pushing forward with this business, even when the hours have been crazy and it hasn't been totally financially viable, and has allowed me to build it to this point where I have a customer base and a community who supports me, and have a financially sound business that's built around whole grain bread and bicycles.
Could you say a little about the bicycle experience?
Yeah, I run my business pretty much entirely by bicycle, except for flour pickup, because I'm like pretty crazy about bicycles, but not crazy enough to bike 20 miles down to the mill and pick up a half ton of flour and bike back. I mean, I don't think that I would be physically capable, even with electric assist. But I think that bicycles, if one is able-bodied, which I am, are the most efficient and economic form of transportation in cities, and it makes a lot of sense to me to run my business by bicycle for those reasons, and also because I really like biking, and I like having a part of my day outside every day, regardless of how busy I am or what else is going on or how many hours I spend in the kitchen. I always have a little bit of the day where I'm out in the world and in the weather, and that feels really important as well.
You good?
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
I think we're good.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.